for the hardest-hitting show in talk radio. The true progressive voice since 2012. This is Southpaws.
And welcome to Southpaws on the Pacifica Radio Network. We are the leaders of the revolution. I'm Darren Gibson, your host today. We have to talk about the latest developments in the Israeli-Hamas dispute. More like a war. Jim Jordan is now up to be House Speaker, but he can't get the votes, so we'll talk about that. We'll talk about the latest involving the Grand Haven, Michigan Board of Light and Power. There's now an attorney has been hired. We have more on Ottawa County's health officer fiasco. We'll talk about that. Ryan Kelly gets 60 days behind bars for his role in the January 6th traitorous riot. He should have got 60 years. And I'll tell you all about it later on this show. Plus, we have an update to Alec Baldwin and the Rust film. Apparently, he might be facing charges after all. So we'll talk about that, plus whatever else we can get to. Before we get started with today's topics, a couple of reminders. You can follow us on social media by going to facebook.com/Southpaws Radio Show. You can follow us on X, the former Twitter, at Southpaws Radio. You can follow us on Tumblr at southpawsradioshow.tumblr.com. You can follow us on YouTube and Mastodon by doing a search for Southpaws Radio. You can become a patron of the show by going to patreon.com/Southpaws Radio. You can listen to the show anytime at Apple Podcasts, Spreaker, Google Podcasts, Podcast Addict, Podvine, and Pandora by doing a search for Southpaws. Once you found our logo, you found us. We send links to our weekly episodes to our Facebook, X, Tumblr, YouTube, and Mastodon accounts. You can listen to us on Global Community Radio Channel 1 every Saturday night at 11 Eastern. And you can listen to us on great Pacifica stations, including KCEI in Taos, New Mexico, and KZGM in Kabul, Missouri. So be sure to listen to us on your local Pacifica affiliate. And if they're not carrying us, please give them a call or write them a letter or an email, however you want to get a hold of them, and just very politely ask them to pick up Southpaws. We would greatly appreciate that. All right, so let's get to the latest between Hamas and Israel. Let's get to this latest story. This is Najib Jobain, Samia Kulub, Ravi Nessman, and Matthew Lee writing for the Associated Press. This is dated October 17th out of Khan Yunis, Gaza Strip. A massive blast rocked a Gaza City hospital packed with wounded and other Palestinians seeking shelter Tuesday, killing hundreds of people. That is according to the Hamas-run health ministry. Hamas blamed an Israeli airstrike. The Israeli military blamed a rocket misfired by other Palestinian militants. The health ministry said that at least 500 people were killed. As rage spread through the region because of the hospital carnage, and with President Joe Biden heading to the Mideast in hopes of stopping the war from spreading, Jordan's foreign minister said his country canceled a regional summit scheduled for Wednesday in Amman, where Biden was to meet with Jordan's King Abdullah II, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, and Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. The war between Israel and Hamas was, quote, pushing the region to the brink, end of quote. That was what was said by Jordanian Foreign Minister Ayman Sadfati. He made that quote to state-run television. He said that Jordan would host the summit only when everyone had agreed its purpose would be to, quote, stop the war, respect the humanity of the Palestinians, and deliver the aid they deserve, end of quote. A White House official said that Biden will now only visit Israel. The explosion at the Al-Ali hospital left gruesome scenes. Video that the Associated Press confirmed was from the hospital showed fire engulfing the building and the hospital grounds strewn with torn bodies, many of them young children. The grass around them was strewn with blankets, school backpacks, and other belongings. The bloodshed unfolded as the U.S. tried to convince Israel to allow the delivery of supplies to desperate civilians, aid groups, and hospitals in the tiny Gaza Strip, which has been under a complete siege since Hamas's deadly rampage in southern Israel last week. Hundreds of thousands of increasingly desperate people were searching for bread and water. These are civilians, folks. Can't get bread or water because of this stupid war. Hamas called Tuesday's hospital blast a horrific massacre, saying it was caused by an Israeli airstrike. The Israeli military blamed Islamic Jihad, a smaller, more radical Palestinian militant group that often works with Hamas. The military said Islamic Jihad militants had fired a barrage of rockets near the hospital, and that intelligence from multiple sources indicated the group was responsible. In a briefing with reporters, Chief Army spokesman Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari said the Army determined there were no Air Force, ground, or naval attacks in the area at the time of the blast. He said radar detected outgoing rocket fire at the same moment, and intercepted communications between militant groups indicated that Islamic Jihad fired the rockets. By the way, I have heard audio of one of these phone calls. We'll get to that in a little bit here. Hagari also shared aerial footage collected by a military drone that showed a blast that he said was inconsistent with Israeli weaponry. He said the explosion occurred in the building's parking lot, and he noted that the death toll could not be confirmed. Since the war began, the military said in a statement that roughly 450 rockets fired at Israel by militant groups had landed in Gaza, quote, endangering and harming the lives of Gazan residents, end of quote. Islamic Jihad dismissed those claims, accusing Israel of, quote, trying hard to evade responsibility for the brutal massacre it committed, end of quote. The group pointed to Israel's order that Al-Ali be evacuated and its previous bombing of the hospital complex as proof that the hospital was an Israeli target. It also said the scale of the explosion, the angle of the bomb's fall, and the extent of the destruction all pointed to Israel. Hundreds of Palestinians had taken refuge in Al-Ali and other hospitals in the Gaza City in the past days, hoping they would be spared bombardment after Israel ordered all residents of the city and surrounding areas to evacuate to the southern Gaza Strip. Ambulances and private cars rushed some 350 casualties from the Al-Ali blast to Gaza City's main hospital, Al-Shifa, which was already overwhelmed with wounded from other strikes, according to its director, Mohammed Abu Selmiya. The wounded were laid onto bloody floors, screaming in pain. He said, quote, we need equipment, we need medicine, we need beds, we need anesthesia, we need everything, end of quote. He warned that fuel for the hospital's generators would run out within hours. And by the way, the Associated Press confirmed that doctors in that hospital were performing surgeries on the floor without anesthesia. I'm reminded by something that Alan Alda said in the series MASH. War is worse than hell. Really it is, folks. Before the Al-Ali hospital deaths, Israeli strikes on Gaza killed at least 2,778 people and wounded 9,700, according to the Gaza Health Ministry. Nearly two-thirds of those killed were children. Another 1,200 people across Gaza are believed to be buried under the rubble, alive or dead, according to health ministry officials. More than 1,400 people in Israel have been killed, mostly civilians who were slain in Hamas's October 7th attack. The assault also resulted in some 200 being taken captive into Gaza. Hamas militants in Gaza have launched rockets every day since, aiming at cities across Israel. Hundreds of Palestinians flooded the streets of major West Bank cities, including Ramallah, the seat of the Palestinian Authority, where protesters hurled stones at Palestinian security forces who fired back with stun grenades. Others threw stones at Israeli checkpoints where soldiers killed one Palestinian, according to West Bank authorities. Elsewhere, hundreds of people joined protests that erupted in Beirut, Iraq, and Amman, where an angry crowd gathered outside the Israeli embassy. In Amman, a palace statement said Jordan's king condemned, quote, the ugly massacre perpetrated by Israel against innocent civilians, end of quote. According to the statement, the king, quote, warned that this war, which has entered a dangerous phase, will plunge the region into an unspeakable disaster, end of quote. With tens of thousands of troops massed along the border, Israel has been expected to launch a ground invasion into Gaza, but its plans remained uncertain. Military spokesman Lieutenant Colonel Richard Hecht said, quote, we are preparing for the next stages of war. We haven't said what they will be. Everybody's talking about a ground offensive. It might be something different, end of quote. Throughout the day Tuesday, airstrikes killed dozens of civilians and at least one senior Hamas figure in the southern half of the Gaza Strip, where the Israeli military told fleeing Palestinians to go. An Associated Press reporter saw around 50 bodies brought to Nasser Hospital after strikes in the southern city of Khan Yunis. The Israeli military said it was targeting Hamas hideouts, infrastructure, and command centers. An airstrike in Deir al-Bala reduced a house to rubble, killing a man and 11 women and children inside and in a neighboring house, some of whom had evacuated from Gaza City. Witnesses said there was no warning before the strike. Shelling from Israeli tanks hit a UN school in central Gaza where 4,000 Palestinians had taken refuge, killing 6 people and wounding dozens. That is according to the United Nations Palestinian Refugee Agency. At least 24 UN installations have been hit the past week, killing at least 14 members of the agency staff. At this point, the United Nations needs to haul Israel right in front of them and condemn them for this. Really, that is a war crime. Got news for you. Again, I'm not condemning Israel or Hamas less or more. They both get equal condemnation. They are both guilty of atrocities. I've got news for you. Let me continue. A barrage of strikes crashed into the Buriyaj refugee camp in central Gaza, leveling an entire block of homes and causing dozens of casualties, according to residents there. Among those killed was one of Hamas's top military commanders, Ayman Nofal. That is according to the group's military wing. He is the highest-profile militant to have been killed in the war. In Gaza City, Israeli airstrikes also hit the house of Hamas's top political official, Ismail Haniyeh, killing at least 14 people. Haniyeh is based in Doha, Qatar, but his family lives in Gaza City. The Hamas media office did not immediately identify those killed. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu sought to put the blame on Hamas for Israel's retaliatory attacks and the rising civilian casualties in Gaza. He said, quote, not only is it targeting and murdering civilians with unprecedented savagery, it's hiding behind civilians, end of quote. With Israel barring entry of most water, fuel, and food into Gaza since Hamas's brutal attack, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken secured an agreement with Netanyahu to discuss creation of a mechanism for delivering aid to the territory's 2.3 million people. U.S. officials said the gain might appear modest, but stressed that it was a significant step forward. Still, as of late Tuesday, there was no deal in place. A top Israeli official said his country was demanding guarantees that Hamas militants will not seize any aid deliveries. Zazi Hanegbi, head of Israel's National Security Council, suggested entry of aid also depended on the return of hostages held by Hamas. More than 1 million Palestinians have fled their homes, roughly half of Gaza's population, and 60% are now in the approximately 8-mile-long area south of the evacuation zone, according to the United Nations. At the Rafah crossing, Gaza's only connection to Egypt, truckloads of aid have been waiting to enter for more than a day. The World Food Program said it had more than 300 tons of food ready to cross into Gaza. That's food that's badly needed by civilians there. I'll say it once again. The Israelis need to quit. Hamas needs to quit. It needs to end now. Return the hostages. Knock all this off. And Israel needs to stop treating Palestinians like human garbage. Sorry, that was their land first. Oh, but the Bible says the Bible. Yeah. A book of fiction wrote by man 2,000 years ago to control other men and all women. Sorry, I don't buy it. That would be the equivalent of giving Britain back to Italy because the Romans conquered it in 400-something AD. Oh, that was their land first. Yeah. Or maybe an even more novel idea would be giving the United States back to the indigenous people that lived here, the Native Americans. You know, the different tribes, Cherokee. I mean, really, that's what it is. Sorry, you can't be hypocritical on this one, folks. You really can't. All right, that's about enough of Israel. I can't handle much more. Let's get to our next story here. This is Lisa Mascaro, Farnoosh Amiri, and Stephen Groves writing for the Associated Press. This is dated October 18th out of Washington. On last week's show, we told you that there might be a new Speaker of the House. Well, that didn't quite happen the way that it was going to. It actually never happened. And the reason it didn't happen is because Steve Scalise didn't have enough votes to get the speakership. So before they even put it up for a vote, he withdrew his name. He was smart. He knew better. Then they decided, oh, well, we'll give Jim Jordan a try. And now he's going through the same steps that Kevin McCarthy's going through. And he's not getting the votes. All it takes, folks, is 5 Republicans to vote for Hakeem Jeffries, and you'll have a Democrat as House Speaker under a Republican-controlled House. Wouldn't that be something? And there might be enough votes to do it. I would. There's a lot of Republicans that do not want Jim Jordan whatsoever. They are a hard no vote, especially after some of the tactics that have been done. Texting the wives of certain members of Congress. If your husband doesn't vote for Jim Jordan, he will never hold elected office again. What is he thinking? He's a traitor. He's a coward. He's this, he's that, he's the other. Serious. These texts have happened. All right, so let's get to our story here about Jim Jordan. Having lost the first vote to become House Speaker and apparently the second one earlier today, which we're recording on Wednesday, October 18th, 2023, Jim Jordan will try again on a decisive ballot that will test whether the hard-edged ally of Donald Trump can win over detractors or if his bid for the gavel is collapsing. Last time I looked, he had 200 on Tuesday. The second vote, which was held earlier today, Wednesday, it was down to 199. So he's losing votes. This is great stuff. I love it. The House gavelled in with angry, frustrated Republican lawmakers looking at other options. Ahead of the morning vote, Jordan made an unexpected plea for party unity, the combative Judiciary Committee chairman telling his colleagues on social media, quote, "We must stop attacking each other and come together," end of quote. Yep. It's Ronald Reagan's 11th commandment, thou shalt never speak ill of another Republican. He's trying that on for size. We'll see how it works. A surprisingly large and politically diverse group of 20 Republicans had rejected Jordan's nomination the day before, many resenting the hardball tactics seeking to enforce support and viewing the Ohio congressman as too extreme for the powerful position of House Speaker, second in line to the presidency. Yeah. It goes Biden, Kamala Harris, Jim Jordan. That scares the hell out of me. That scares the living hell right out of me. Some predicted the number of dissenters would grow rather than shrink during next round voting, and were floating a plan that would give the interim speaker pro tempore, Representative Patrick McHenry, Republican of North Carolina, more power to reopen the House and conduct routine business. Almost daring his colleagues to put forward the proposal, Jordan said at the Capitol, quote, "Let's get an answer. We've been at this for 2 weeks. American people deserve to have their government functioning. Let's get an answer," end of quote. Yeah, they need to have it functioning. Get rid of the Republicans and it'll function just fine. The House has hit a standstill, stuck while Jordan worked to shore up backing from Republican colleagues for the job to replace the ousted Kevin McCarthy. Republicans are exhausted by the infighting since McCarthy's sudden removal by hardliners who are now within reach of a central seat of U.S. power. The vote for House Speaker, once a formality in Congress, has devolved into another bitter showdown for the gavel. With Republicans in majority control 221 to 212, Jordan must pick up most of his GOP foes to win. Tuesday's tally, with 200 Republicans voting for Jordan and 212 for the Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries of New York, left no candidate with a clear majority, as the 20 Republicans voted for someone else. Can you blame them? Let's see. My choice is old Jim or somebody else. I'll pick somebody else. Jim Jordan, brother. Jeffrey swiftly intervened, declaring it was time for Republicans to partner with Democrats to reopen the House in what would be an extraordinary, if not unprecedented, moment in congressional history. Yeah, Hakeem Jeffries is saying, hey, come over here. We'll get the House in order. Bipartisan groups of lawmakers have been floating ways to operate the House by giving greater power to McHenry or another temporary speaker. The House has never ousted its speaker before McCarthy, and the lawmakers are in rarely tested terrain. The novel concept of boosting the interim speaker's role was gaining favor with a pair of surprisingly high-profile Republicans. Former Republican speakers Newt Gingrich and John Boehner. Gingrich said while he likes Jordan, he has no faith the nominee can get much beyond the 200 votes he won in the first vote. Gingrich told Fox propaganda channel Sean Hannity on his show, quote, "We can't sit around and suck our thumbs and hope the world will wait until the House Republicans get their act together," end of quote. Boehner reposted Gingrich's views on social media and replied, quote, "I agree," end of quote. The problem is that the Republicans aren't sucking their thumbs. They're sucking one of Donald Trump's appendages, which I cannot reveal on FCC-regulated airwaves. The two men have deep experience with the subject. Both were chased to early retirement by threats of ouster from right-flank insurgents like those who toppled McCarthy. Jeffrey said, quote, "The Republicans are unable to function right now," end of quote. He said talks would accelerate between Democrats and Republicans on alternative plans. But with public pressure bearing down on lawmakers from Trump's allies, including Hannity, it's unclear how long the holdouts against Jordan can last. Already, some lawmakers said their first vote was merely a protest and they would be with Jordan on next rounds. Well, that didn't happen. Donald Trump said outside of a courthouse in Manhattan where he's facing business fraud charges, quote, "Jim Jordan will be a great speaker. I think he's going to have the vote soon, if not today, over the next day or two," end of quote. Oh, really? Yeah, shut up, Donnie. We don't want to hear your orange mouth, your orange anus that's between your nose and your chin, because all it spews is shit. Flexing their independence, the holdouts are a mix of pragmatists, ranging from seasoned legislators and committee chairs worried about governing to newer lawmakers from districts where voters back home prefer President Joe Biden to Donald Trump. Some Republicans resent being pressured by Jordan's allies and say they are being threatened with primary opponents if they don't support him as Speaker. Others are simply upset at the way the whole process has dragged out. As Tuesday's somber roll call was underway, each lawmaker announcing their choice, the holdouts quickly surfaced. Representative Don Bacon, Republican of Nebraska, a leader of the centrists, voted for McCarthy, the ousted former speaker. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Others voted for Majority Leader Steve Scalise, who was the party's first nominee to replace McCarthy before he, too, was rejected by hardliners last week. And by the way, it's Don Bacon that his wife received the text messages saying, "If your husband doesn't vote for Jim Jordan, he'll never hold office again anywhere." So there you go, folks. I think that pretty much has cemented Don Bacon to a hard no on Jim Jordan. One, Representative Mario Diaz-Balart, Republican of Florida, a veteran appropriator, said later that he would not be, quote, "pressured or intimidated," end of quote, over his vote. Quote, that millisecond when anybody tries to intimidate me is the moment where I no longer have the flexibility. End of quote. Another holdout, Representative Ken Buck of Colorado, said Jordan's role in the run-up to the January 6, 2021 traitorous attack on the U.S. Capitol and his refusal to admit that Biden, a Democrat, won the 2020 election remained an issue. By the way, I added the word traitorous because those people that day were traitors. Period. End of story. We'll talk about one of those traitors a little later on in this show. Jordan has been a top Trump ally, particularly during the January 6 Capitol attack by Trump's backers who were trying to overturn the 2020 election he lost to Biden. Days later, Trump awarded Jim Jordan a Medal of Freedom. The political climb has been steep for Jordan, the combative Judiciary Committee chairman and a founding member of the Right Flank Freedom Caucus. Like they give a shit about freedom. Give me a break. He is known more as a chaos agent than a skilled legislator, raising questions about how he would lead. Congress faces daunting challenges, risking a federal shutdown at home if it fails to fund the government, and fielding Biden's request for aid to help Ukraine and Israel in the wars abroad. Immediately after the vote, Jordan conferred with McCarthy, who fared nearly as badly in January, having lost almost as many votes on the first of what would be a historic 15 ballots for the gavel. First elected in 2006, Jordan has few bills to his name from his time in office. No, that's not accurate. He has 0 bills to his name, not one. He also faces questions about his past. Some years ago, Jordan denied allegations from former wrestlers during his time as an assistant wrestling coach at Ohio State University who accused him of knowing about claims they were inappropriately groped by an Ohio doctor. Jordan has said he was never aware of any abuse. Yeah, really. Yeah, he knew, and he kept his mouth shut. Sorry, my opinion. So we may or may not have Jim Jordan as House Speaker by the time next week's show rolls around, so I don't know. Oh boy, let's get to some more election news. Let's actually focus on the state of Michigan. This is Anna Liz Nichols writing for Michigan Advance. This is dated September 12th. Yeah, it's an older article, but it's an important story that I want to get to. And it was one I was meaning to get to before I went on vacation. Election officials, including Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson, told lawmakers about death threats and other vitriol they have faced while operating elections ahead of what they believe will be another contentious election cycle in 2024. They spoke at the House Elections Committee hearing in support of bills that would define intimidating or preventing an election official from performing their job as a felony punishable by up to 5 years in prison and a $1,000 fine. Benson recalled an armed protest outside her home in December 2020 following the election where Donald Trump lost to President Joe Biden. Benson said the protesters demanded she overturn the results of the election in which Biden won Michigan by more than 154,000 votes. Benson said, quote, there are times where I've put my kid to bed at night and then listened to a text message or voicemail on my phone saying that someone can't wait to see me hanging by a tree. It is all too horrific to hear these things, and for simply doing our jobs, whether we be statewide or working in small towns, it's imperative that the state of Michigan protects these civil servants who are simply trying to operate our elections in a transparent and accessible way. End of quote. Lansing City Clerk Chris Swope said election officials are already leaving their jobs due to the rising violence, adding that one of his closest friends in the clerking world left the profession due to harassment and intimidation. Swope said, quote, I myself once received an email where someone threatened to slit my effing throat if I emailed him again. All I was doing was a reminder that he needed to return, multiple voters needed to return their ballot in advance of Election Day. End of quote. Just for that reminder, he gets an email that if you ever email me again, I'm going to slit your fucking throat. Conservatives are nothing but violent. That's all that is running through their veins is violence. fear, and violence. They don't care. House Bill 4129, sponsored by State Representative Cara Hope, Democrat of Holt, would create the specific prohibition on intimidating an election official. The bill defines an election official as officers or officials with election-related obligations. It defines intimidation in this context as harassment, quote, that would cause a reasonable individual to feel terrorized, frightened, threatened, harassed, or molested, and that actually causes the individual to feel terrorized, frightened, intimidated, threatened, harassed, or molested, end of quote. House Bill 4130, also sponsored by Hope, would amend sentencing guidelines outlined in House Bill 4129 for a new felony, intimidating an election official or preventing an election official from performing the election official's duties. This felony would carry a maximum penalty of 5 years in prison and a $1,000 fine. Half of election workers who responded to a 2022 survey from the Brennan Center for Justice fear for their colleagues' physical safety, while 1 in 4 respondents are concerned they themselves will be assaulted at work. The survey adds 1 in 6 election officials have been threatened on the job, and 77% said the threats have increased in recent years. Sherry Ritchie of Pure Integrity Michigan Elections, an election denier organization, said in opposition to the bills that they go too far. She said, quote, Michigan absolutely cannot start making people felons if someone else says that their feelings were hurt. This sort of legislation can open doors for groups of people to be attacked for their beliefs. Poll watchers and challengers come to mind. Michigan already has laws preventing intimidation and assault and legal methods in place to handle difficult individuals at polling locations or anywhere else for that matter. End of quote. By the way, the House Election Committee has not voted on the bills. They have been submitted to the House, and there has been an amendment added on September 19th, and that's where things stand with both House Bill 4129 and 4130. Right now, let's head off to Ottawa County, Michigan. This is Sarah Leach writing for the Holland Sentinel. This is dated October 18th out of Grand Haven. We told you about the problems with Grand Haven's Board of Light and Power. Well, here's an update to it. An outside legal firm hired to investigate whistleblower allegations against the Grand Haven Board of Light and Power says the inquiry is expected to take about a month and the total cost is not yet known. On September 18th, the city, in a 5-2 vote, authorized city manager Ashley Latch to hire special legal counsel to conduct an independent investigation in response to a whistleblower complaint against the GHPLB. The whistleblower, who has not been publicly identified, contacted City Attorney Ron Bolcha in early September through their personal attorney, handing over a cache of approximately 200,000 emails that allegedly support claims that the Board of Light and Power conducted a coordinated attempt to destroy documents to circumvent a Freedom of Information Act request, repeated false and misleading statements to employees regarding a proposed charter amendment to dissolve the BLP, attempted to avoid compliance with the requirements of the Open Meetings Act, and pressured employees to sign a letter to contribute funds and distribute door signs, all opposed to the charter amendment, potentially in violation of state law. At the city's Monday, October 16th meeting, the city unanimously approved the appointment of Michael Homier of Grand Rapids-based Foster Swift to lead the independent review of the whistleblower allegations. Latch wrote to the board in her recommendation that Homier has extensive experience in municipal work, citing the firm's deep bench of legal experience as well as its own in-house information technology capabilities. In the contract that expires at the end of the year, Homier will charge an hourly rate of $315. So $315 an hour to investigate this. The investigation is expected to last approximately 1 month. Sarah Riley Howard of Grand Rapids-based law firm Pinsky Smith is representing the whistleblower. Howard said, quote, "My client decided the only right thing to do was to bring what he knew to the BLP's lawyer. He did so at personal risk to his job and working environment. We are looking forward to the findings of the special investigator." End of quote. Mayor Pro Tem Ryan Cummins and Councilmember Karen Lowe defended their decision to work with Bolcha to prepare the resolution authorizing an investigation, saying transparency and responsiveness were paramount to the integrity of the inquiry process. Lowe said in September, quote, "These were very uncomfortable allegations to be put forth. It's unfortunate that we are in the position to make a decision. Inaction is not really a way to reestablish public trust." End of quote. She said the complaint could potentially implicate GHBLP board members and staff, making an independent investigation more appropriate. Cummins said, quote, "The council has been criticized for sort of picking at the Board of Light and Power, but really it's been others that have brought things forth. And now we have new allegations that, if true, are in violation of civil and criminal laws." End of quote. Grand Rapids-based attorney Brad Glazier, who's represented whistleblowers throughout his legal career, said there are several items investigators look for when such a complaint is made. Glazier said, quote, "I'm looking for the elements of what needs to be proven in court, which is, first of all, that the employee reported to a public agency something that employee felt was illegal. Then the second thing that I look for is whether or not there was some adverse action taken against the employee, which typically means being fired, could mean a demotion, but typically the employee was fired, and then whether there is evidence to tie the termination to the whistleblowing activity." End of quote. Glazier said it's important for the investigating body to have ample time and resources to ensure the result is thorough and conclusive. Quote, "Anytime you hire an investigator, you want to give that person the resources and time necessary to investigate all of the individuals that are alleged to be part of the illegal activity or the whistleblowing. And so often it does take some time to get those interviews completed, and then the investigator also has to prepare a report. And so it can take certainly weeks, in rare cases months." End of quote. So we'll keep you updated on that. On last week's show, we told you about Adeline Hambley winning and losing in the Michigan Court of Appeals. They ruled that she was the rightfully hired health officer for Ottawa County, but then said that the Ottawa County Board of Commissioners could vote to fire her if she violated state law. So let's get to this story. This is also Sarah Leach writing for the Holland Sentinel, dated October 13th. Ottawa County's health officer has asked a circuit court to reinstate a preliminary injunction against the Board of Commissioners trying to fire her, or at least delay a scheduled removal hearing until a judge can set the ground rules. Just one day after the Michigan Court of Appeals issued an opinion affirming Adeline Hambley was properly appointed health officer in December, she filed a new request with Michigan 14th Circuit Court Judge Jenny L. McNeil asking for enforcement of a preliminary injunction issued in April to help determine the processes available for a just cause termination. Hambley's attorney, Sarah Riley Howard, who we mentioned in the other story, wrote in the filing on Friday, October 13th, quote, "Hambley seeks a stay of the October 24th termination hearing planned by the commissioners." End of quote. It continues, quote, "The Court of Appeals affirmed the grant of a preliminary injunction to Health Officer Hambley as was amended to permit the commissioners to move to terminate Hambley only under the limited circumstances of just cause as found in MCL 46.11N, and only if they adhere to the requirements of a fair hearing with all that due process requires." End of quote. The statute Howard cites says in part that a county commission may, quote, "remove an officer or agent appointed by the board if, in the board's opinion, the officer or agent is incompetent to execute properly the duties of the office, or if on charges and evidence the board is satisfied that the officer or agent is guilty of official misconduct or habitual or willful neglect of duty, and if the misconduct or neglect is a sufficient cause for removal." End of quote. Howard argues the charges brought forth against her client do not meet that sufficiency threshold, nor will the process comply with the lower court's preliminary injunction. McNeil, who presided over the case after all Ottawa County judges recused themselves, granted Hambley a preliminary injunction on April 18th, allowing her to remain in her role until the trial could take place later this year. The Michigan Court of Appeals denied commissioners the right to appeal that ruling, but later granted a narrow window to appeal certain aspects, mainly whether the judge made legal errors in reaching her decision. The Court of Appeals reaffirmed Hambley as the county's duly appointed health officer on Thursday, but noted the board still has the right to fire her if proper procedures are followed. Howard is now requesting a termination hearing be delayed until, quote, the parties can present evidence on Hambley's motion for an order to enforce the preliminary injunction and until this court can rule on what is required at the termination hearing, end of quote, in order to comply with state law. Hambley sued commissioners in February, claiming the board's Ottawa Impact majority attempted to unlawfully demote her and repeatedly interfered with her state-authorized health duties. As we've told you before multiple times, Ottawa Impact is a far-right fundamentalist group created by Ottawa County Board Chair Joe Moss and Vice Chair Sylvia Rodea after they unsuccessfully challenged the previous board and county health officer over COVID-19 mitigation mandates in 2020 and 2021. Moss filed notice September 27th that a removal hearing was planned over allegations of, quote, incompetence, misconduct, and neglect of duty, end of quote. Moss's allegations revolve largely around health department budget negotiations, which culminated in $4 million in board-orchestrated cuts and a half a dozen layoffs for the fiscal year that began October 1st. The allegations include Hambley demonstrated incompetence, misconduct, and neglect of duty by making false public representations about budgetary scenarios. Hambley demonstrated incompetence, misconduct, and neglect of duty by falsely claiming that she was not included in the budget process. Hambley demonstrated incompetence, misconduct, and neglect of duty by failing to cooperate in the budget process. And Hambley demonstrated incompetence, misconduct, and neglect of duty by making false claims that encouraged and caused confusion, anxiety, fear, and panic in the community. Meanwhile, County Corporation Counsel David Coleman said Thursday the board was pleased with being allowed to proceed with a termination hearing against Hambley, but said it plans to appeal the ruling that Hambley was the rightfully appointed health officer to the Michigan Supreme Court. He said, quote, obviously, we disagree with the second half, which was their determination that under the circumstances, the resolution controls over the minutes. We don't believe that's a correct determination, so we'll be appealing that to the Michigan Supreme Court, end of quote. Howard said because the board plans to continue disputing that Hambley is the rightful health officer at all, there should be no need for a termination hearing. Howard wrote, quote, since that is the position they take, which would again indicate that the commissioners do not believe that they need to have a hearing under MCL 46.11n, Hambley seeks a stay of the October 24th hearing until the Supreme Court determines whether to grant the application, end of quote. When asked why a termination hearing is necessary, Coleman said, quote, Ms. Hambley's position has been all along that she has held the office as the permanent health officer, and it is the board's position she was interim. Frankly, I think it doesn't matter. Whether it's interim or full, they're still going to hold their hearing, so what difference does it make? End of quote. Howard said her client shouldn't be subjected to a public firing until these issues are sorted. Quote, Hambley should not have to go through the hearing when the commissioners assert it doesn't really matter. End of quote. Yeah. I tell you what, don't mess with Howard. She will eat your lunch. All right, let's get to our next story here. This is an update to something we told you about. We did live coverage of Ryan Kelly getting arrested at his home in Allendale Township last year, which was great. I loved every second of it. This is Michael Kunzelman writing for the Associated Press. This is dated October 17th out of Washington. A federal judge on Tuesday sentenced a former Republican candidate for Michigan governor to 2 months behind bars for joining a mob's January 6, 2021 attack on the U.S. Capitol, where he riled up other rioters and ripped a tarp outside the building. Ryan Kelly, who finished fourth in a primary field of 5 Republican gubernatorial candidates last year, pled guilty in July to a misdemeanor for his role in the siege. Several months before his guilty plea, Kelly posted on social media that the Capitol riot was an FBI setup. His campaign posted the words political prisoner on Facebook after his June 2022 arrest. Now he will be a prisoner. U.S. District Judge Christopher Cooper told Kelly that he misused his platform as a candidate for public office by promoting lies about election fraud, including the baseless claim that January 6 was somehow part of an FBI plot. Before sentencing Kelly to 60 days of imprisonment and ordering him to pay a $5,000 fine, Cooper said, quote, "A lot of folks voted for you, a lot of folks followed you," end of quote. The 42-year-old Kelly traveled from Allendale, Michigan to Washington, D.C. to attend Donald Trump's Stop the Steal rally near the White House on January 6th. Kelly told the judge that he wanted to see receipts supporting Trump's claims the Democrats stole the 2020 presidential election from him. He said, quote, "Those receipts never came. That is a betrayal, and I was misled into believing those things," end of quotes. Bullshit. Liar. But he said he doesn't blame Trump for his conduct on January 6th. Kelly said, quote, "He did invite us there, but my actions were my actions," end of quote. Yeah, you damn right they are. But you did it at Trump's order, so there you go. Kelly, a real estate broker, isn't accused of engaging in violence on January 6th, but federal prosecutors said he helped breach scaffolding, stirred up the mob with his shouts, and gestured for other rioters to move closer to the Capitol and to police officers guarding the building. Kelly pleaded guilty to entering and remaining in a restricted building or grounds, a charge punishable by a maximum prison term of 1 year. Prosecutors recommended sentencing Kelly to 3 months of incarceration. If they wanted my recommendation, I would have given him 60 years. Let him rot. Let them all rot. Prosecutor Shania Watson said, quote, "Mr. Kelly engaged in not just a bad decision, but a series of bad decisions that day," end of quote. Yeah, that's the understatement of the year. Kelly's arrest roiled what was already a complicated Republican primary for the governor's race. Conservative commentator Tudor Dixon won the Republican primary, but ultimately lost to incumbent Governor Gretchen Whitmer, a Democrat, last November. Kelly spoke at a Stop the Steal rally at the state capitol in Lansing in November 2020, shortly after the presidential election. Kelly urged others at the rally to, quote, "stand and fight with the goal of preventing Democrats from stealing the election," end of quote. That's according to what the FBI said. After attending Trump's rally on January 6th, he marched to the Capitol and joined a crowd that formed on the West Plaza, where flashbang grenades exploded near him. Kelly and other rioters climbed through scaffolding covered by a white tarp. Surveillance video captured him tearing the tarp. Prosecutors wrote in a court filing, quote, "Even though his rip of the tarp was relatively modest, it extended an already existing hole in the tarp and widened the opening through which some rioters advanced on the Capitol building," end of quote. Kelly remained on Capitol grounds for nearly 2 hours, but isn't accused of entering the building that day. His defense lawyer wrote, quote, "Mr. Kelly understands and appreciates that he never should have participated in the protest that turned into a riot that day and that such violence has no place in our democracy," end of quote. Now, I don't believe him. He is a liar. He is a conservative. They lie. They will say anything to get out of trouble. At a debate last year, Kelly said the riot was, quote, "a First Amendment activity by a majority of those people, myself included," end of quote. Not when it becomes a riot. It's no longer First Amendment. He added, quote, "We were there protesting the government because we don't like the results of the 2020 election, the process of how it happened. And we have that First Amendment right. And that's what 99% of the people were there for that day," end of quote. Really? So why did they enter the Capitol if they were just there to protest? Why did they break windows, bust in doors, take a fire hydrant to a Capitol police officer's skull and killed him? Why? In a court filing after the primary loss, Kelly's lawyers said that he was, quote, still actively involved in political issues throughout the state and is contemplating whether he will run for a different state or federal position, end of quote. Defense attorney Gary Springstead said on Tuesday that Kelly, quote, wants nothing to do with politics at this point, end of quote. I say bullshit to that. He's a liar. Kelly told the judge that he wants to focus on his business and his family, and I hope they both crumble. I hope the people don't hire him, and I hope his wife finally grows a brain and says, I've had enough of you, buddy, and leaves. Oh, Jesus Christ. More than 1,100 people have been charged with Capitol riot-related federal crimes. More than 800 of them have pleaded guilty or been convicted by a jury or judge after contested trials. Nearly 700 of them have been sentenced, with roughly two-thirds receiving terms of imprisonment ranging from 3 days to 22 years. Also on Tuesday, a woman who smashed a window at the Capitol and used a bullhorn to direct other rioters on January 6th was sentenced to 4 years and 9 months in prison. Yee-hee-hoo! Way to go. U.S. District Judge Royce Lamberth also ordered Rachel Marie Powell to pay restitution and a fine totaling nearly $8,000. That's good. In July, Lamberth heard testimony without a jury before he convicted Powell of all 9 counts in her indictment. A prosecutor has said that the 41-year-old Sandy Lake, Pennsylvania resident played a leading role during the riot. I believe she did, using a bullhorn. So there you go, folks. You're not going to get away with it. Don't do it. And we have one final update we want to get to. This is Morgan Lee writing for the Associated Press. This is dated October 17th out of Santa Fe, New Mexico. Now, we've covered a little bit of the Alec Baldwin Rust movie set shooting, so this is a new update to this. Special prosecutors are seeking to recharge actor Alec Baldwin in the fatal shooting of a cinematographer on the set of a Western movie in 2021, describing Tuesday their preparations to present new information to a grand jury. New Mexico-based prosecutors Carrie Morrissey and Jason Lewis said they'll present their case to the grand jury within the next 2 months, noting additional facts have come to light in the shooting on the set of the film Rust that killed Helena Hutchins. Baldwin, a co-producer of the film, was pointing a gun at Hutchins during a rehearsal inside a rustic chapel on a movie set ranch near Santa Fe when the gun went off on October 21st, 2021, killing the cinematographer and wounding director Joel Souza. In an email, Morrissey and Lewis said, quote, after extensive investigation over the past several months, additional facts have come to light that we believe show Mr. Baldwin has criminal culpability in the death of Helena Hutchins and the shooting of Joel Souza. We believe the appropriate course of action is to permit a panel of New Mexico citizens to determine from here whether Mr. Baldwin should be held over for criminal trial. End of quote. They declined to elaborate on the additional information they may present to the grand jury. Baldwin has said that he pulled back the hammer but not the trigger and the gun fired. Attorneys for Baldwin said the latest move by prosecutors is misguided. In an email, Luke Nikas and Alex Spiro said, quote, it is unfortunate that a terrible tragedy has been turned into this misguided prosecution. We will answer any charges in court. End of quote. Special prosecutors initially dismissed an involuntary manslaughter charge against Baldwin in April, saying they were informed the gun might have been modified before the shooting and malfunctioned. They later pivoted and began weighing whether to refile a charge against Baldwin after receiving a new analysis of the gun. The recent gun analysis from experts in ballistics and forensic testing based in Arizona and New Mexico relied on replacement parts to reassemble the gun fired by Baldwin after parts of the pistol were broken during earlier testing by the FBI. The report examined the gun and markings it left on a spent cartridge to conclude that the trigger had to have been pulled or depressed. The analysis, led by Lucien Haag of Forensic Science Services in Arizona, stated that although Baldwin repeatedly denies pulling the trigger, quote, given the test's findings and observations reported here, The trigger had to be pulled or depressed sufficiently to release the fully cocked or retracted hammer of the evidence revolver. End of quote. An earlier FBI report on the agency's analysis of the gun found that, as is common with firearms of that design, it could go off without pulling the trigger if force was applied to an uncocked hammer, such as by dropping the weapon. The only way the testers could get it to fire was by striking the gun with a mallet while the hammer was down and resting on the cartridge, or by pulling the trigger while it was fully cocked. The gun eventually broke during testing. Authorities have not specified exactly how live ammunition found its way on set and into the .45 caliber revolver made by an Italian company that specializes in 19th century reproductions. The weapons supervisor on the movie set, Hannah Gutierrez Reed, has pleaded not guilty to involuntary manslaughter and evidence tampering in the case. Her trial is scheduled to begin in February. In March, Rust Assistant Director and Safety Coordinator David Halls pleaded no contest to unsafe handling of a firearm and received a suspended sentence of 6 months of probation. He agreed to cooperate in the investigation of the shooting. In the revived case against Baldwin, first reported by NBC News, special prosecutors said a grand jury would, quote, determine whether probable cause exists to bind Baldwin over on criminal charges, end of quote. Naima Rahmani, a former federal prosecutor who provides legal commentary as head of West Coast Trial Lawyers in Los Angeles, said prosecutors reserve the right to reopen the case by dismissing charges without prejudice, and that he'd be surprised if a grand jury didn't return an indictment. Rahmani said that unlike a jury trial in which guilt must be proved beyond a reasonable doubt, the standard on possible charges before a grand jury is a lower probable cause finding. He said, quote, it's just a one-sided presentation by prosecutors, end of quote. The 2021 shooting resulted in a series of civil lawsuits centered on accusations that the defendants were lax with safety standards. The cases have included wrongful death claims by members of Hutchins' family. Baldwin and other defendants have disputed the accusations that they were lax with safety standards. The company, Rust Movie Productions, has paid a $100,000 fine to state workplace safety regulators following a scathing narrative of safety failures in violation of standard industry protocols, including testimony that production managers took limited or no action to address 2 misfires on set before the fatal shooting. The filming of Rust resumed this year in Montana under an agreement with the cinematographer's widower, Matthew Hutchins, that made him an executive producer. So we'll be following this case. There's a possibility Alec Baldwin might face some charges on the death of Helena Hutchins, and probably rightfully so. That's it for this week. We'll be back next week. I'm Darren Gibson. Make sure you please support independent media, the First Amendment, and a woman's right to choose.
The stations that carry Southpaws do not necessarily share the opinions expressed on the show. Southpaws is protected by the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution and is copyrighted by Big D Entertainment. All rights reserved.